In September of 1975, a 10-year-old girl sat down with her diary and wrote a sentence that should have solved a murder. She had no forensic training. No detective experience. No power of any kind. She was just a child who had seen something wrong and had no one safe to tell. So she wrote it down, in the careful and unsteady handwriting of someone still learning to form her letters, and then she closed the diary and put it away. She kept it for 48 years. Moved it from house to house, from childhood to adulthood to middle age, through every headline and every decade of silence. And when she finally opened it in front of 2 Pennsylvania state troopers, what was inside brought a 50-year-old murder case to its knees. If this kind of story is why you're here, hit that like button right now, subscribe to True Crime Traces, and leave a comment telling us how you found this channel. Every single comment helps us keep telling stories like Gretchen's. Now let's get into it. It was the summer of 1975, and Broomall, Pennsylvania was the kind of town where danger felt like something that happened somewhere else. Families had deliberately packed up from Philadelphia and relocated to these quiet, tree-lined streets because of the freedom those streets gave their children. No check-ins. No curfews. No fear. Parents waved goodbye at the front door in the morning and expected their kids home by dinner, and for years, nothing had given them a single reason to doubt that. Broomall was not naive. It was just untouched. Gretchen Harrington was 8 years old that summer, the third of 4 daughters born to Harold and Anna. Harold was a pastor, steady, devoted, the kind of man whose whole life ran on faith and routine. Anna sewed her girls' clothes by hand and held everything together without fanfare. They were not complicated people. They were, by every account, simply good. And Gretchen fit that life perfectly. She was the kind of child who made friends without trying. Private school classmates, public school neighbors, kids from church, it didn't matter who you were. Gretchen was happy to know you. Her sister Anne said she didn't have a mean streak anywhere in her body. Her best friend said they never once had a single argument. Gretchen also had one thing she was quietly proud of that week, a perfect attendance record at Bible school. Not a day missed. And this Friday was the last day of the program. The day they handed out the certificates. She was not going to miss it. That same morning, Anna Harrington was being discharged from the hospital, coming home with baby Jessica, the 4th Harrington daughter. The house was full of warm anticipation. 12-year-old Zoe and 11-year-old Harriet stayed home to wait. It would have made sense for Gretchen to stay too. But Harold believed in honoring your commitments, even when the world around you was pulling in another direction. So he looked at his 8-year-old daughter and told her to go. Keep the streak. It was less than half a mile. She had walked it every day that week. Gretchen grabbed her Bible, got dressed in stripes paired with plaid because she genuinely didn't care about matching, and headed for the door. Harold stepped outside and watched her start up the hill on Lawrence Road, her small figure growing smaller with the distance. He watched until she was far enough along that everything looked completely fine. Then he went back inside. He had no reason to suspect anything. But the moment he turned away from that door was the last time he would ever see his daughter alive. At 9:25 that morning, a neighbor spotted Gretchen near the intersection of Lawrence Road and Sussex Boulevard. She was close to the church. Almost there. The neighbor described her as determined and focused, a little girl who knew exactly where she was going. That was the last confirmed sighting of Gretchen Harrington. Somewhere between that intersection and the church, in the final stretch of a walk she had made 4 times that same week, something happened. Investigators found no signs of a struggle anywhere along that route. No disturbance in the ground. No trace of anything at all. The trail simply ended. She had almost certainly gotten into a vehicle without a fight, without a scream, without leaving a single mark on the world to say she had been afraid. Which meant she hadn't been afraid, not at first. Because she knew the person behind that wheel. Around 11 o'clock, a group of Gretchen's friends showed up at the Harrington front door, expecting her to be home. She wasn't. Harold felt the first cold wave of alarm move through him. He called Trinity Church. He walked Lawrence Road himself. He checked nearby streets and doubled back toward the creek. Nothing. At 11:23, someone called the Marple Township Police Department and reported Gretchen missing. The man on the line was one of the most trusted figures in that entire community. He said he hadn't seen Gretchen. Said she never showed up to camp. But then, without being asked, he described her clothing in precise detail. The color of her shorts. The zipper. The snap closure. The pockets on each side. The absence of visible buttons. These were clothes Aina had sewn entirely by hand. A specific, homemade pattern. The kind of detail you carry in your memory because you had been close enough to observe it clearly, that very morning, in person. And yet this man was telling police he had never seen her. Investigators quietly circled his name at the top of their list. And then, for reasons never fully explained, they left it there for decades without ever acting on it. That phone call was already the center of everything. It would just take the world 48 years to fully understand that. By Saturday morning, Broomall had transformed overnight. More than 400 volunteers flooded the streets, neighbors, firefighters, church members, strangers who had driven in from surrounding towns just to help. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter swept continuously overhead. Bloodhound units were deployed. Volunteer firefighters waded through Darby Creek. Search teams pushed through nearly 2 feet of dense underbrush across more than 5 square miles of terrain. They found nothing. But it was the dogs that told the real story. Trained bloodhounds can follow a scent trail across hours, across rain, across brutal terrain. These dogs found nothing past a certain point on Lawrence Road. No trail. No disruption in the soil. No struggle. The scent simply stopped, clean, sudden, final, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. That was the moment this search changed its character entirely. Whatever had happened to Gretchen Harrington had happened fast, and quietly, and without a fight. Inside the Harrington home, Harold and Aina waited. Baby Jessica cried the way newborns cry, thin and insistent, filling every corner of the house. And underneath that sound sat a silence that grew heavier by the hour. One daughter had arrived. One daughter had vanished. The house held both of those truths at the same time and could make no sense of either one. A hotline was established, and in the first days alone it received over 200 calls. Tips poured in: a green station wagon near the church, a pickup truck parked halfway up the hill, a white compact on Lawrence Road. Too many vehicles, too many descriptions, until the weight of conflicting information became its own dead end. But one detail kept returning from multiple witnesses who had no connection to each other: a green station wagon, near a young girl, near the church, that morning. Logged, noted, and buried under everything else. By Sunday, Police Chief Daniel Hennessy stood before reporters and said the words that landed like a verdict: "We haven't got a clue." The large-scale search was called off. The town adapted the way frightened communities do, quietly and devastatingly. One of Gretchen's Bible school classmates had her long hair cut short by her mother that very same week. Short enough to look like a boy. The thinking was heartbreaking in its simplicity: make her look like something else so the danger passes her by. Gretchen's disappearance didn't just frighten parents. It made them start disguising their daughters. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Then came October. 60 days after Gretchen walked up that hill and never came back, a Navy seaman jogging through the trails of Ridley Creek State Park stopped and saw something that didn't belong in those woods. He ran to find a park ranger. What investigators found when they arrived would stay with everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Gretchen's remains were in a small clearing, 2.5 miles from where she had last been seen alive. The clothing was still there, and the clothing told a story no one could explain. Her blouse, the one Aina had sewn by hand, was folded neatly and placed beside her in a careful pile. Her shoes were on the ground nearby. And her underwear had been hung from a tree branch directly above the scene. The original 1975 Philadelphia Inquirer described it as hung like a flag, as if to call attention to the place. Think about what that means. Someone had stayed at that scene long enough to arrange things. To fold a child's clothing. To hang something from a branch. Whether it was ritual, compulsion, or something else entirely, it pointed to a deliberate mind, someone who felt, in some dark and unreachable part of themselves, that what they were doing had its own order. That detail would haunt investigators for decades. Harold and Aina were brought to the police and shown the clothing found at the scene. Harold looked at the fabric, the stitching, the specific and unmistakable way those clothes had been made, and said, "There is absolutely no doubt it was hers." The medical examiner confirmed identification through dental records. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, 2 or more severe impacts, a depressed fracture. The kind of force that only comes from deliberate, violent intent. Gretchen had been killed intentionally by someone who then carried her body 2.5 miles into the woods, arranged her clothing, and walked back out into the world as if nothing had happened. 5 days later, Harold stood at his church pulpit and delivered a sermon to his silent congregation. A man who had just identified his 8-year-old daughter through her dental records spoke these words: "Gretchen, with her simple faith, is free. But her killer is in terrible bondage." At Gretchen's funeral, the man leading the service, offering comfort, praying over her coffin, was the same man who 2 months earlier had described her handmade shorts in precise and impossible detail while claiming he had never seen her that morning. He stood at that podium and he prayed. He comforted Harold. He comforted Aina. He was the pastor. He was the family friend. And nobody in that room had any reason to look at him differently than they ever had. The investigation followed leads that dissolved one by one. A convicted child rapist named Richard Bailey, seen less than a mile from where Gretchen vanished on the morning she disappeared, was investigated seriously, but his DNA was never compared to evidence from the scene. He died in state prison, and whatever he knew died with him. The evidence box at Marple Township Police Department gathered dust. Detectives would pull it out occasionally, looking for the thing everyone before them had missed, and put it back frustrated. Years passed. Decades. The original lead detective retired and then died. The case moved from desk to desk. Gretchen Harrington remained unsolved. But in a house about 3 miles from Broomall, a woman had been holding on to something since 1975. Something she had written down as a 10-year-old girl in a childhood diary, in the careful handwriting of someone who knew she had seen something wrong but had no one safe to tell. She had kept that diary for 48 years. And she still had it. In the fall of 2022, 2 journalists, both Broomall natives who had grown up in the shadow of Gretchen's disappearance, published a book about the case. It reopened old wounds and resurfaced old memories. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, a woman read something that finally pushed her past a line she had been standing behind for nearly half a century. Sergeant Nick Coffin of the Marple Township Police found a voicemail waiting for him. A woman said she thought she knew who was responsible. She said she had kept a diary since 1975. And she still had it. On January 2, 2023, Pennsylvania state troopers sat down with her, identified in court documents only as SF. She was now in her late 50s, and she had lived with what she knew for 48 years. SF had been close friends with the daughters of David Zandstra, a pastor, a respected community figure, a man the Harrington family trusted completely. She had spent time at his home regularly and slept over often. She told investigators what had happened during 2 of those sleepovers. She was 10 years old. She and Zandstra's daughter had gone to bed. In the middle of the night she woke to find David Zandstra in the room, acting inappropriately toward her. He shifted her body and left immediately, fast and practiced, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and when to stop. She told herself it was nothing. And then it happened again the following night. Same darkness. Same movement. Same immediate retreat the moment she stirred. The next morning she told Mara, Zandstra's own daughter, what had happened. And Mara said something SF never forgot: he does that sometimes. Some nights I hear my sister crying. A child telling another child that her own father's behavior was so routine it had its own quiet and resigned acknowledgement inside that house. No alarm. No surprise. Just a little girl who had learned to sleep lightly. SF went home and told her parents. They banned her from the Zandstra house immediately, no formal complaint, no report filed with police. This was 1975. He was a pastor. Who would believe a 10-year-old over a man of God? 1 week later, Gretchen Harrington disappeared. SF had carried that knowledge from childhood all the way into middle age. Now she set her diary on the table in front of the troopers. Worn edges, yellowed pages, the unsteady handwriting of a little girl still learning to form her letters. She turned to the entry dated September 15, 1975, 1 month after Gretchen vanished, and read it aloud. Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone. But I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z. A 10-year-old girl with no power of any kind had written down the name of the man she believed had taken her friend. Had kept it for 48 years. In legal terms, that diary entry was a contemporaneous record, written at the time, by a witness with direct knowledge, long before any arrest or trial, long before anyone had reason to fabricate anything. The kind of evidence that cannot be created after the fact. David Zandstra was 83 years old, retired from ministry, living quietly in a lakefront home in Marietta, Georgia. He had no idea what was coming. On July 17, 2023, 2 Pennsylvania state troopers flew to Georgia and arranged to meet Zandstra at the Cobb County Police Department, framing the visit simply as needing a DNA swab, at his convenience, no pressure. What they were actually doing was closing a door that had been open for 48 years. Zandstra was sharp in that interview room, almost unsettlingly sharp. He recalled church names and congregation details across 6 decades with ease. At one point he corrected Corporal Martin on a factual detail. He was not a confused old man. He was present, composed, and in control. Then Martin shifted the conversation to August 15, 1975. The ease evaporated instantly. My brain is 83 years old, he said. You're asking me things I'm unsure of. The man who had just corrected a trained detective was suddenly uncertain about a morning nearly 50 years ago. He denied seeing Gretchen. The same account he had given in 1975. She never arrived. He never saw her. He had no idea anything was wrong until Harold called. Then Martin told him about SF, the sleepovers, what she had witnessed in the night, and what his own daughter Mara had said in response. And something in Zandstra's face shifted. Not dramatically. A settling. A deflation. As if something he had held upright for a very long time had finally gotten too heavy. He started to talk. He said he saw Gretchen that morning, walking up the hill alone. He recognized her immediately. He pulled up beside her in his green AMC Rambler station wagon and offered her a ride to church. She accepted without hesitation. Of course she did. She knew him. He did not drive her to church. He drove her to a secluded section of Ridley Creek State Park. He parked. He made demands. She refused. She begged him to take her home. She was terrified on that drive, pleading with him to turn around, to let her go. He kept driving. And then, in the confession that Trooper Trey would later say came out with something resembling relief, not remorse, not grief, but relief, Zandstra said he struck her in the head with a rock. Checked for a pulse. Found none. covered her body with sticks and branches, and left. Then drove back to the church and went about his day. When the troopers pressed him, "Why, how could you, what were you thinking?" Zandstra reached for the framework his entire life had been built on. He said that like King David, his biblical namesake, he had sinned, and through confession he would find forgiveness. He had killed an 8-year-old girl, stood at her funeral, prayed over her coffin, watched her family grieve for 48 years. And he was framing it as a spiritual transaction. A debt to be settled with God. Not with Gretchen. Trooper Trey said afterward he didn't know if Zandstra was sorry. What he did know was this: it looked like a weight coming off his shoulders. Martin had not brought an arrest warrant to Georgia. Nobody had expected a confession. He borrowed a laptop from a local officer and drafted the affidavit of probable cause on the spot, while the man who had just confessed to murder sat nearby. Zandstra was taken into custody that same day. Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolsteimer stood before cameras and said what Broomall had been waiting nearly 5 decades to hear: David Zandstra is every parent's worst nightmare. He killed this poor 8-year-old girl, a girl he knew, a girl who trusted him, and then acted as if he was a family friend, not only during her burial, but for years. The community exhaled. They had no idea what was coming. The courtroom in January of 2025 was quiet in the way that only rooms carrying 50 years of unfinished grief can be. Zandstra, now 84, sat at the defense table and pleaded not guilty. His attorney argued that his client was not a calculating killer who had finally been caught. He was an 83-year-old stroke survivor diagnosed with vascular dementia, subjected to a 4-hour interrogation in an unfamiliar building with no attorney present. Then the attorney called Corporal Martin to the stand, and Martin acknowledged what the defense had been building toward. He had lied to Zandstra during the interview. He told him a witness had specifically identified his green Rambler approaching Gretchen that morning. Not true. He told him police had recovered bloody rocks from the crime scene. Also not true. Legal interrogation tactics, but stated plainly in a courtroom, they sounded like two detectives constructing a false reality around a vulnerable man until he stepped inside it. Then came the DNA. Forensic testing on Gretchen's clothing found biological material from 3 separate people, 2 unidentified men and 1 unidentified woman. Not one of them was David Zandstra. He was entirely excluded. 3 unknown profiles on the clothing of a murdered 8-year-old girl, still unmatched, still unidentified, belonging to people whose names nobody knows. The prosecution argued that Zandstra's confession contained details only the actual killer could have known: Gretchen's terror on the drive, her begging him to turn back, the rock, the branches. Details that come from memory, not suggestion. But the damage was done. The jury deliberated for 1 hour. 1 hour after a 4-day trial and 48 years of questions. They came back, not guilty on all counts. David Zandstra stood from the defense table and hugged his attorney. His family gathered around him. He was going home. Gretchen's family said nothing publicly. There was nothing left to say. Zandstra returned to his lakefront home in Georgia. During his 18 months in custody, his cancer had returned and gone untreated. Within months of coming home, he was dead at 85. His family filed a federal lawsuit in January of 2026 against both troopers, alleging a coerced confession, wrongful incarceration, and untreated illness. The plaintiff was Margaret Zandstra, the same woman who had brought dinner to the Harrington home on the night Gretchen disappeared, more than 50 years before. The man who confessed is dead. The alternate suspect died in prison decades ago. 3 DNA profiles remain unmatched in any database. The Pennsylvania State Police say the case is closed. Gretchen Harrington remains officially unsolved. She never got her perfect attendance certificate. That was what she was walking toward, a small piece of paper recognizing that she had shown up every single day without fail. She was 8 years old, Bible in hand, stripes with plaid because she never cared about matching, moving up that hill with the certainty that only children who feel completely safe can carry. 50 years later, 3 unknown DNA profiles sit in a database with no names attached to them. A diary written by a 10-year-old girl was the closest thing to justice this case ever produced. And somewhere in Ridley Creek State Park, in the memory of everyone who was there in October of 1975, a piece of clothing still hangs from a tree branch like a flag, calling attention to a place where someone left a child and walked away, and has never once been held accountable. If you know anything about what happened to Gretchen Harrington, the Pennsylvania State Police tip line is still active. Justice does not have an expiration date. But for Gretchen, it is running very, very late. If this case stayed with you, and we believe it will, share this video with someone who needs to hear Gretchen's name. Subscribe to True Crime Traces so you never miss a case. And drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think justice was served the day that jury came back? Or did it walk out of that courtroom while an entire community stood watching in silence? We read every single comment. Because stories like this one don't stay cold forever, not when people keep asking the question. We'll see you on the next case.